This video is an introduction to qualitative research. When we start talking about qualitative research, most of the time people will start with something like a journal article or an example of qualitative research. And generally speaking, it will be presented in a way that is quite linear. So you'll start with the research topic and then move into the research questions within that topic, which leads you to designing the study, collecting the data, analyzing the data, generating findings, validating those findings, and writing a research report in a nice, orderly fashion. That is great for presenting information in a way that a recipient can interpret and understand. However, when you actually sit down to do qualitative research, you might find that you don't necessarily stick to those nice dark paths that go from 1 to 2 to 3. You may start with a research topic and then design a study, and from that design, determine what research questions you have. That may seem very counterintuitive to anyone like me who has a nice quantitative linear brain, but it works much better with qualitative research because of the human element that qualitative research brings. With qualitative research, you can start collecting data, realize that your research questions aren't represented in the data you're collecting, and then redesign your study or redesign another phase of the study to get to those research questions. Similarly, you may actually change your research questions. This is not something you want to deal with IRB or with any kind of oversight committee. So oftentimes, qualitative research studies will be designed with extraordinarily broad research questions, and then sub-questions will be defined from that are more appropriate for the data that ends up being collected. Because oftentimes with qualitative data collection, you'll end up having people say things you did not expect, or things will go in a direction that you did not expect. And so you have to be prepared for that with qualitative research. So, in qualitative research, we have 12 major characteristics. And the first few of these are design strategies. You can structure a qualitative study around some kind of naturalistic inquiry. So you're really just observing a situation and recording what you observe. For instance, if you take qualitative data collection and analysis with Dr. Cutforth once he's back from sabbatical, or with any of the other qualitative professors, one of the things you have to do is a non-participant observation. So you're going to a place and you're just observing what the culture is in that place, how people interact with the space and with other people in that space. So you're not interfering, you're not adjusting anything, you're not doing any kind of experiment, you're just observing. There's also emergent design flexibility. And so when you are doing a qualitative study, you may modify the design as the study is occurring in response to what's occurring either in the space, in the place, in the people, in the events, or in the space around the people. And that those definitions, what is the space, what is the place, are flexible depending on, for instance, if you are, I don't know, teaching a class during a pandemic, you might have to totally revise how you are going to approach things. Similarly, if you are doing a study and something insane happens, like large-scale civil unrest or large-scale protests, you may need to drastically modify the qualitative study as it's occurring. That's a lot easier with qual than quant studies. Quantitative studies, because of the statistics and because of the math underlying a lot of those studies, you don't have that flexibility. But with qualitative research, you do, and you can be responsive to what's going on in the environment. Qualitative research also allows for purposeful sampling. You can target specific populations or specific groups in a way that quantitative research studies don't allow. Qualitative research is also not intended to be generalizable. If you are a qualitative researcher, you're not worried about the experience of all students in grades K through 5. But you may be interested in the experience of students at a specific school for a specific reason. And thus, you're not trying to generalize to the entire K-5 population. You're only trying to understand the experience of the students in that one specific school, or maybe even a one specific classroom or teacher. So with that, we have several data collection strategies for fieldwork in qualitative research. And one of the big things is to think about what kind of data qualitative actually means. What does qualitative mean? Qualitative refers to qualities. So rather than counting things, you're referring to um, what kinds of what kind of things are you looking at? What color of things are you looking at? You're not measuring the actual wavelength of light coming off of the cars that pass you. You're just saying, is it a red car or is it a blue car? And then inferring things based on people's reaction to that. There's also a lot of personal experience and engagement occurring in qualitative research. You get to know your study participants, particularly if you're using certain qualitative research designs. The researcher is not separate from the researched or the research participants. And oftentimes, in several qualitative designs, you'll actually have the participants be collaborators in the research study. So they're actually fully integrated into not only figuring out what research needs to be done and collecting the data, but also in the analysis and in the write up and in all stages of the qualitative study. There's also much more empathic neutrality and mindfulness occurring in qualitative research. You very rarely is a qualitative researcher going to say that any action or any belief held by research participants is right or wrong. Instead, they're going to be mindful of their own preconceived notions of right and wrong and find a way to set them aside and not have to worry about whether or not they are actually relevant to the research. Qualitative research is also very good at assessing dynamic systems. So looking at change as it is occurring. You're not collecting data before the change and after the change and doing some kind of pre-test, post-test, or anything like that. You're trying to understand how are people reacting to the change in real time? How is it this change event impacting people, and how are people responding to that impact? Maybe it's a natural disaster or some kind of flood. You would be looking at not how many people survived, but how did people feel about survival? Why did they choose one course of action over another? And when we get to qualitative data analysis, there is this orientation around unique cases. In quantitative data, you'll remove outliers. You need a normal distribution. You essentially say, oh, that data point isn't relevant because something weird was occurring. With qualitative data, you're focused on those outliers. You're saying, okay, why didn't this case match all the others? Why was this individual's outcome not what we expected? So you can hone in on those outliers and explain them in a way that quantitative analysis cannot. There's also inductive analysis and creative synthesis, and by that we mean that qualitative research is not separate. A qualitative study is not separate from what's going on around it or what's going on in the rest of the world or what's going on in the rest of the literature. Instead, you're combining multiple frames of reference, multiple viewpoints, multiple perspectives to synthesize the essence of either an experience or of a culture or of a group. And with qualitative data, you are using a holistic perspective. You're not necessarily going to worry about whether it is because an individual is of a certain ethnic group or of a certain religion. You're going to understand how those combine to give that individual their unique perspective on the world. And of course, we would be, in a good qualitative study, we would be looking at many traits that an individual might have that contribute to that perspective rather than just ethnicity and religion. There's also context sensitivity in qualitative research. So you not only have to be sensitive of the context of the study, so is the study being conducted by a university, by a think tank, by a policy research group, by just a individual graduate student, and how is that research being published? Is it being put out in a context that is accessible to the participants? Is it accessible to the general public? Is it accessible to other researchers? There's all these layers of sensitivity in the research outcomes, as well as the research itself. What is the context of the study design? You'll see things like participatory action being much more common in qualitative research because you can be more sensitive to the context of a given community or a given subpopulation. And ultimately, qualitative research gives voice and perspective to participants, potentially to the researcher, potentially to marginalized groups who otherwise would be ignored because they are statistical outliers or because they don't fit with the preconceived notions. And it allows you to be much more reflexive and reflective. So both reflexive thinking and reflective thinking in the entire research process. So with qualitative research, we have several approaches, and these approaches can kind of be mixed and matched with subsequent videos on these different qualitative research methods. So the approaches to qualitative research, these pull from the social sciences broadly, but specifically anthropology and sociology. So structuralism refers to the importance of cultural structures. So things like institutions, things like political organizations, educational organizations, those kinds of structures that frame society, religious organization. So you may be looking at something like the structure of a church and potentially the structure of a religious order or an entire religion. You may be looking at the functional relationships. How does a religious organization interact with social welfare organizations, things like food banks, or providing housing for impoverished individuals in either their local community or around the world? And ultimately, structuralism is trying to understand how the structure of society gives rise to different human behaviors and how people conceptualize their behavior within that larger society. So, structuralism, not surprisingly, is focused on the underlying structure of whatever social phenomenon or social organization or social thing you're concerned with. Modernism refers to a period in the history, generally of scientific view, that looked at the world as a static machine. So it really was conceptualizing of the entire world in a very positivist frame, in a very linear process where you can understand and break down every piece of that static machine to understand how people follow the general laws of behavior. When we say laws of behavior, we're not referring to legal laws or policy. We're referring to laws that govern behavior broadly. And that may be behavior of individual people within a society, maybe the behavior of the society at large, or it may be the behavior of those aforementioned structures of society or social organizations. So, with that, positivism is an outgrowth of scientific thinking and the rationalization of the world, very unfortunately applied in a very imperialist way for a long time. But positivism is the belief that there is a truth. There is a truth out there, and true knowledge has to be based in science and in that rationalism. So, whatever is true must be rooted in verifiable fact. Post structuralism, also sometimes post positivism, post structuralism rejects universal truth. So it's rejecting the idea that there is a universal truth, that there is one reality, and instead looks at the differences between groups, the differences between individuals, deconstructs those differences, and tries to interpret them to understand how the power of ideas impact people's behavior. So, how do their beliefs impact their behavior? How does what they feel is true affect their interpretation of reality? Um, with the notion that there is no objective reality. Um, that can get very meta, but personally, over the past couple of years, I've been able to understand this post structuralist view a bit more just based on current events, and I will leave it at that. Postmodernism really takes everything and puts it in a blender and pours it out and says, "Isn't this wonderful?" That's not a dig at postmodernism. Postmodernism is extremely useful, um, but it is much more based on self image. It's much more based on um, individuality, how change affects people, and how people change in response to all of the insanity of the world around them. And really, how do individuals build their own foundations of thought, build their own understanding of reality by interpreting all these different things going on around them in a very um, individualized and self reflective way, rather than there being any kind of objective reality. So, those approaches to qualitative research can be applied to these different research kind of strategies. And those are phenomenology, ethnography, case studies, grounded theory, and narrative inquiry. And I'm going to put together videos on each of these so that you can have them to reference, especially as you're going through your own study if you're using any qualitative method. And I will hopefully be able to link some additional resources for further reading should you decide you would like to or want to pursue one of these methods. Oh my god, why won't you just stop recording?